thanks. There's something about the wood panelling on the walls that makes us feel like we're at school and we've got to behave. Welcome, everyone. This is the Innovation Zero Communications Forum. My name is Stuart Goldsmith. I'm a climate comedian. I know I'm not necessarily going to do a huge amount of jokes for you here, but what being a climate comedian means is that almost all of my gigs end in catastrophe, but I remain optimistic despite the data. So I'm going to be doing some opening remarks for you now, which is a fun thing for me. Before we start, we've got a whole host of things. What shall I do first? I'll just do the admin first, and I'll tell you what's going on. Each one of these talks that you're going to see this morning, which is my bit, each one of these talks is going to be 20 minutes. I don't think many of them are going to have an opportunity for Q&A, but you can use this incredibly technical-looking QR code to ask questions on Slido. And I have been informed that even if we don't have time for Q&A at the end of the talks, if you ask something on Slido, it will eventually be transmitted in some sort of electronic form to the speaker, who may or may not get back to you. We also have cards with a QR code for ideonomy. And ideonomy is a thing that I'm going to have to read you what it is. This year, Innovation Zero is taking it up a gear. We, like you, want to see action. We want to see problems being solved. We want to see change happen. And so Innovation Zero is the first event in the world to partner with a game-changing new startup called Ideonomy. So this is a collaborative innovation community that brings people together across sectors to solve problems, supported by machine learning and AI. But they still have to use business cards. You will see QR codes dotted around the event. You can submit, view, and rank the most important problems across each forum to create a prioritized list of problems so we know where to focus our joint innovation efforts. After the event, we'll set up a series of new problem-solving teams. You can meet people who share the same problem as you, regardless of what sector they originate from. So scan the QR code to get going. So that's that. 20-minute sessions. The first one of those is in a little while. And that, I think, is all of the things I need to tell you at the moment. Were you here yesterday? Yes, some of you. Hands up if you were here yesterday. Very good. Hands up if this is your first thing. I know. Well done for finding it. It's not, do you know what I mean? I walked in, I was like, where's the, oh right, quite a distance away from this. So what I will tell you, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do in the realms of climate communication. I go into businesses and I brief with their chief sustainability officers and I try to find out what problems they've got, what internal communications they've got that need recharging, and then I try and write bespoke jokes about them and smuggle them into my existing climate comedy material in the hope that I can influence people with their hands on the levers of real power to help, to motivate, to make things work a little bit faster and smoother. But the challenges that I face, and maybe as communicators yourselves or people interested in communication, maybe you face some of these challenges as well. Predominantly, whenever I start a conversation with anyone, not anyone here, but anyone in the real world, about climate, the conversation is in danger of becoming a bit stilted. It becomes a bit eggy. Do you know what I mean? I had a conversation with a friend of mine over a year ago now, who I hadn't seen since before the pandemic, and we were chatting in a bar, and she was very excitedly telling me all about this trip of a lifetime that she was about to go on to New York with 10 of her friends. And then she said, and what have you been up to? And I had to say, oh, I'm writing a new stand-up comedy show about the climate crisis. And I didn't look down my nose at her, I didn't condemn her in any way, but her whole body language changed as if she was thinking but not saying, oh God, you're one of those knobs. And I understand where she's coming from, because the very next thing she said to me, she said, are you going to tour the show? And if you are going to tour it, how are you going to cope with the demands of net carbon neutral touring? And I just thought, oh God, you're one of those knobs. So I do understand it. I think that whenever I'm faced with a climate conversation, whenever I'm faced with a conversation or a new fact or a new story in the front page of the newspapers, some new thing, it's in danger of kicking me down the well. Now, I have a well in my head, maybe you do too, a deep borehole in the ground with a little stone, a well, you know what a well is. And every time I hear something new, something negative, something I hadn't considered before, some habitual behavior that I have, that I've been doing sort of unthinkingly, it kicks me down the well. And I fall down this sort of endless chasm, slapping and bashing against the walls, and I land at the bottom feeling despair. I feel anger, I feel selfishness, I feel selfish. I find myself thinking in the back of my head, I'm thinking, what can I do to make sure that my guys are okay in the future? How can I protect my family and my, my descendants to make sure we're okay. Because you'll be familiar with this phenomenon in the States of preppers. We've all heard of preppers. You have the right-wing preppers who hoard guns and ammunition, and then you have the left-wing preppers who hoard community and networks and mutual aid. And I'm definitely one of them, but if that doesn't work out, it would be good to have some guns. I find myself having these very selfish thoughts. I'm thinking, how am I going to enact my plan to seize and hold our local city farm? Because I can get in easy enough, and I'd definitely reinforce the fences, but then how am I going to get the staff to treat me as their king once money has no meaning? Because I don't know how soil works, so I will need them. So I sit there, and I feel all this negativity. I feel depressed, I feel anguished, I feel anxious, until I can scrape together whatever positive notions that I can to use as pitons, to use as climbing spikes, to think a positive thing, jam it into the sides of the wall and climb back up the well, one positive notion at a time. So I think to myself, we're a planet of 8 billion problem solvers. One of us is going to think of something. I go, and mantle my way up. I think we have a lot of the technological solutions. What we need are the narratives. We need the political will. I think to myself, hey, come on, we solved the hole in the ozone layer. Did we? I feel like I hear less about it, and presumably no news is good news. And I eventually mantle my way back up to ground level, because that's where the tools are to fight the climate crisis. They're at ground level. They're not stuck at the bottom of a well. So with that in mind, I want to talk to you about some of the strategies that I use when I'm communicating with people. I think the main one when you're trying to connect with people is to try and be as honest as possible, to try and be authentic. And I think certainly for comedians, and I've interviewed over 450 other comedians for a podcast that I've been doing for the last 12 years. It's the only not funny comedy podcast by design. And it's called The Comedian's Comedian, and it's a series of interviews with comics, initially about their writing process, and then latterly about how they cope. Because I realised that the defining characteristic of all comedians is not whether we're funny or not, it's whether we're resilient. It's actually impossible to do our jobs without the ability to have a horrible time on stage, take a real kicking from the audience, and then come off stage and not think, oh my God, I'm never going to get back up there again, but instead cultivate the ability to go, right, let me get back up there. I think I can do it differently this time. And I think from all those interviews, what I've synthesized about authenticity is that it is about taking a genuine risk. It's about looking an audience in the eye and saying, I feel like this. I'm going to tell you how I most honestly feel. I'm going to tell you the difficulties I'm having, the fears that I have, and tell you as honestly as possible with as much detail as possible. And I think if you zero in on those details and you can take that risk of sharing something that if you get it wrong might make you feel like an idiot. Every comic has been in a situation where we've said, hey, we all feel like this, right, guys? And everyone's just looked at them and gone, no, we don't. And you go, right, that was the cost. That was the price I had to pay for taking that risk. So with that in mind, on the subject of resilience and kind of self-talk and trying to build your most resilient self in order that you can communicate effectively, I'm going to tell you now about the worst gig I ever did. And then we can get underway with the first of today's talks. I have been heckled in my long comedy career by the very best of the best. I've been heckled by the police, by the British Army, by 400 9-year-olds. I've been heckled by my own dad, and I've been heckled by a person who had Tourette's syndrome, who in between ticks was also heckling me. One of the most painful I think I've ever suffered was at a new material gig in Angel in Islington, a long time ago, maybe 10 or 11 years ago, when I was doing some new material online, taking risks, trying to establish with an audience whether the ideas I had any relatability, any common ground with them. And I was about 5 minutes into a 10-minute set, performing to fewer people than this in a room twice the size. Absolute silence. All of my precious new ideas are flying out of my mouth one by one and crashing and burning before my eyes. And an elderly lady sat on her own in the front row, looked up at me and said, "Stop." And I mean, it was pretty painful. But that was not the worst. The worst was at a gig it was a Christmas gig a few years ago in Manchester in a club called the Frog and Bucket. Is anyone familiar with Manchester or with that club? It's exactly as genteel as it sounds. And it's a fantastic club. It's launched loads of brilliant comedy careers, Steve Coogan, Caroline Ahern, and what have you. And this was a Christmas gig. So the conditions were suboptimal. Now, at a Christmas gig, no individual person, because they're all works groups, they're all work parties, no individual person has opted into comedy. They've all been brought. So it's big groups of people and like one poor table of a couple who are just like, what are we doing here? And when I'm in those situations, particularly in the Northwest, because I come from the generic south of the country, I often begin my gigs in the Northwest, in Liverpool or Manchester, by saying something along the lines of, good evening, everyone. Let's start with the obvious. I'm not from round here. That'll provoke some sort of response, and I'll improvise off the back of it. It's a high-risk strategy, but it pays off from time to time. So this gig, honestly, I can't tell you, it was like an airport concourse. There were just people walking around with drinks, everyone shouting at each other, music in the background. The local compere went on, brilliant comic, couldn't get a single moment of focused silence. And then he did his best for like 7 or 8 minutes, and then he kind of looked at me waiting in the wings, kind of gave me a, I did my best expression. He said, please welcome Stuart Goldsmith. So I walked on, and I employed a further high-risk strategy. I said, hey, let's deal with the obvious. I'm not from round here. Boos and jeers, and one particularly vicious heckle from someone front and centre, which I won't repeat here. So I employed this further strategy. I said quite truthfully, oh, isn't that interesting? The bloke that's just shouted that horrible thing we all heard, he's the same guy who accidentally offered me cocaine in the toilets here 5 minutes before the gig, thinking I was one of his group. The room went completely silent. All of the air sucked out of it. Because now not only am I not from round here, I'm also a grass. They hated me. I'm no lie. I was making my mouth dry to think of it. I performed to 25 minutes of angry silence. It was awful. I tell a lie. There was one moment where someone else got up to cross the stage and go to the loo. I went, he's off for a line. They laughed, and then they remembered they hated me. I saw the light. I'm staring, willing the light to go off that tells you when you've done your allotted time. Eventually, the light went off. I said, that's my time. I think I stopped in the middle of a joke. I said, thanks very much, everyone. Have a great Christmas. I've been, and then I said the name of my friend who's a comedian. And then I walked off stage. I got in my car, and I had to drive half an hour to Warrington to do it again. And I'm just very quickly, before we start, I'm going to tell you the story of that car journey. Because I'm undergoing an enormous amount of sort of self-doubt, self-loathing. I'm going through all of these negative thoughts as I sit in the car. I remember one point, 2 minutes in, I stopped at some lights. I touched my face, and my hand felt cold against my face, and my face felt cold against my hand. And I thought, am I medically in shock with how bad this is? But I've got a responsibility. I've got to get there. I've got to do it all again. 28 minutes left to go. I have to take all of those negative thoughts, all of the hopelessness, all of the dread, all of the despair. I have to drag it into the light, explode it with logic, so that I can arrive there so I can get on and do my job. And that's what we all have to do when we're trying to climb out of the well of our own anxiety, our own dread about the climbing. I'm thinking to myself, okay, the negative thoughts I'm having are things like, I never want to do this again. I could quit. I thought there must be other things in life than stand up. I've had a good go. I'll turn my phone off, drive home, and I'll just throw my phone away the next morning, and then I won't need to hear the angry promoter at the other end. I thought, I'm not supposed to be here. I thought, I'm an imposter. And the worst thought of all, I thought that little gremlin voice at the back of my head that goes, you can't do this. You always doubted yourself and you were right. This experience seemed to prove that that little gremlin voice was telling the truth. So I had to take all of those things one by one, drag them into the light and blow them up. I thought, I'm not supposed to be here. I thought, I am. That was a risk, and it was a reasonable risk to take. You know, the reason you take those risks is because sometimes they pay off. You shouldn't play it safe. That's the riskiest thing you can do. I thought, I'm an imposter. I thought, I'm not an imposter. I'm not doing stand-up comedy to get rich or famous. I'm doing it because I love it, and I have the right to try. Even if I wasn't the right person or I didn't make the right decision at that time, I still have the right to try. I thought, I want to run away. Of course I want to run away. I'm feeling very physically scared. My sympathetic nervous system's gone haywire, but I'm not going to run away. That's a decision that I'm making. So I arrived at Warrington. I was desperate to tell them what had just happened, but I remembered another golden rule of comedy, never open with the new stuff. So I went out into the gig. I bit down on it, came out swinging, ended up having a really, really positive gig. And at the very end, I said to them, listen, this is my last gig before Christmas, and I really needed this. I told them what had just happened. And they absolutely loved it, because the people of Warrington hate the people of Manchester. And my enemy's enemy is my friend. So I just want to leave that with you for a second. On that subject as well, I don't know if I'll get the... Oh, no, am I out of time? Time to go, okay. Not to enjoy the sound of my own voice too much. Some thoughts there about resilience and about how to cope, how to treat yourself well, and how to climb yourself back up out of that hole. With that in mind, we have our first speaker now, And can I see our first speaker is in the room? This is great. This is like a comedy gig where you go, please welcome the stage, and no one's there. And you go, no, I'll riff. So here we go. Coming up later in the day, we are going to have talks. We're going to have a surprise announcement at 12:50 about a major nationwide net zero collaboration. We've Impact Evolution at 12:30, Marketing, the missing piece in the Scope 3 puzzle at 11:55. At 11, the format changes, that's cute. 11:30 from ESG to Impact. 11:05 is Anthropology and a key to effective ESG and sustainability communication. But our very first speaker today with a talk called Igniting Change, a journey through the climate funnel. Would you please welcome with warm appreciation the founder of Good Ripple, Carlos Terrell. We're going to have a 5-minute break. Ah, okay. No, that's all right. Sort of thing that could have gone in a script.